So as discussed, we're going to talk about the rule of threes and the actual rule itself, as well as the algorithm that then you are to refer to after you look at the rules. So the first thing to remember is that we cannot code 0, 4, or 8 on the MDS unless every episode of documented ADL performance was coded as 0s, 4s, or 8s. That being said, you still must consider those 0s and the 4s when you're applying the rule of threes. So simply because you can't put it on the MDS doesn't mean that those things don't count as levels. So the 2006 rule of threes that everyone had been looking at pretty much is very specific to outline this. They tried to clarify it a little bit with the new manual that's coming out October 1, 2017 to give a little bit more structure to this because they identified that a lot of people were still struggling with the clarity of what was going on and how people were coding things. So they did try to make it a little bit clearer. But we're going to deal with what we put together here, and then we'll talk about the one that was redone at the end of the slide. So when you have an activity that occurs 3 or more times at any one level, you're going to code that level. That one's pretty easy peasy. We don't usually have trouble with that. So you see that there's 3 or more 3s, and you would go ahead and code a 3. You can't code 4 because it didn't happen all the time. You can't code 8 because it didn't happen all the time. And you don't have multiple times at 3 or more times. So that one's pretty easy to be a 3. When an activity occurs 3 or more times at multiple levels, you're going to code the most dependent level that occurred 3 or more times. So again, not so bad. You got a bunch of 2s, you got a bunch of 3s. You know you can't code 4 because it has to be all the time. You can't code 8, it have to be all the time. 3 is more dependent than 2, so you're going to code the most dependent level that occurred at 3, and you're going to have a 3. Again, not so bad. We don't usually get these wrong. Where we start to have some difficulty is where we have to now start to interpret and go through a series of steps to determine how we should code something. So rule number 3 has 3 parts, 3A, 3B, and 3C. And so this is only looked at when an activity occurs 3 or more times at multiple levels, but not 3 times at any one level. All right, so you would start to apply this when that occurs. So for 3A, you would convert episodes of full staff performance to weight bearing. So you convert 4s to 3s, and if it makes it 3 or more times at a 3, you would code a 3. Now this doesn't say that there, but the clarified one does. So you have a couple of 2s, you have a couple of 3s, you convert these 4s to 3s, and now you have 3 plus episodes of 3, and you are okay to code a 3. When there's a combination of full staff performance and weight bearing that totals 3 or more times, you're going to code extensive. So for 3B, we've got 2 3s here, we've got some 4s, we don't have anything else going on there, you would code a 3. Say when the 4s and the 3s equal 3 or more times, you're going to code a 3. C, when there's a combination of full staff performance, weight bearing assistance, and or non-weight bearing that totals 3 or more times, you'd code a 2. So when you have a total of 4s, 3s, and 2s that are equal or greater to 3 times, you're going to code a 2. So you see you've got 1 3 here, you've got 2 2s, a couple of 1s. The 4 is there, even if you converted that and it went to the 3, you wouldn't have 3 times. So it's telling you when you have all of that combination, you would code a 2. And when none of this works for your documentation, you are obligated to code supervision. So that's when it gets tricky, when we have to start coding supervision, when we have these other things that are kind of distracting us. And I think what ended up happening is that because we were all so familiar with the exceptions, the 0s, the 4s, and the 8s, that we disregarded those 0s as an actual level when we were looking at this documentation. And if we saw something that occurred 3 or more times, we were trying to apply a rule when we shouldn't have been. All right, so when you look at this documentation, you have 0 at multiple episodes that equal 3. That is a level. So if you were to follow this rule, you're going to see that you can't get there from there. When an activity occurs 3 or more times at one level, code that level. Well, you can't code 0 because it's an exception. all right? And it must be 0 for all episodes. So that rule doesn't work. Then you move down. When an activity occurred 3 or more times at multiple, you're going to code the most dependent that occurred 3 or more times. It didn't occur 3 or more times at multiple levels. There was only 2 1s, 2 2s, and 2 3s. Okay, so that rule doesn't apply. Then we go to rule 3. When an activity occurs 3 or more times and at multiple levels, but not 3 times at any one level, you're going to apply A, B, or C. The problem is that we can't move on from here because it did occur 3 times at one level. 0 is a level. All right, so when we're looking at that, we've got to apply the rule accordingly, and it says if none of these conditions are met, then you have to code supervision, which is a 1. All right, so hopefully everyone understands that. So here's the clarified Oktober rule. It hasn't changed it. They've just added a couple of things to make sure that everyone understands how to do this. So first thing is you review the instructions for the rule before you even move on to that algorithm. Follow these steps in sequence and start by counting the number of episodes at each ADL performance level. You already know the exceptions. The rule number 3. The rule of threes does not apply when you're coding independent, total, or activity did not occur because it has to happen every single time. Rule of threes obviously will not apply when it only happened once or twice because you don't have 3 times to even work with. Then we start. Activity occurs 3 or more times any one level, code that level. Their clarification was to remind you of the exceptions for independence and total. When an activity occurs 3 or more at multiple levels, code the most dependent. Again, they're reminding you of the exceptions of independent and total. When an activity occurs 3 or more times at multiple levels, but not 3 times at any one level, underlined, capital not, apply the following in sequence as listed. Stop at the first level that applies, and then they again say to you, note, this third rule only applies if there are not any levels that are 3 or more episodes at any one level. Okay, so they bolded that, they highlighted it, they put it in there twice. They want you to understand that when you see 3 zeros, that's 3 times at one level. All right, we can't disregard that, and you would not go on any further and you would code it as supervision because it doesn't meet any of the other criteria.